The most common question that I, or probably any other spiritual teacher gets, is how do I stop suffering? Suffering is one of the most common experiences of being a human being. It almost seems as though to be born is to experience some degree of suffering. It's true that some people live in a very, very dense state of suffering, and other people live in a much less dense state of suffering. But to some extent or another, almost all beings will experience suffering in their lifetime. And since suffering involves some of the most powerful and difficult moments a human being will ever have, it's vital that we have some wise way to address it, some way of dealing with it that actually helps us to become free of its grip. I want to start out with a story. One time at a retreat that I was teaching at, a woman came up to the microphone and she said, "I feel such immense rage inside me. Even as I'm sitting here at this retreat, when I'm not being disturbed and I'm not being challenged, I just feel so much rage. I'll look at people and I'll find myself judging them and being resentful of them for no reason whatsoever." And she said, a lot of my life I walked around really, really angry. And I could see in her eyes and in the way she held her body that this emotion of rage and anger had really kind of taken over her whole system. So what I said was, "I don't want to talk to you, I want to talk to your rage." And at first she looked at me kind of perplexed. She didn't really know what I meant. So I said it again. I said, "I want to speak to the emotion of rage. Tell me how it views life, what it thinks about others. What are its judgments about the most significant people in your life?" And she almost looked at me with horror and she said, "Oh no, not that." And I said, yes. That's what I want to talk to. I want you to give rage a voice. Stop holding yourself as separate from it. Stop trying to get rid of it, but actually just for a moment, let your mind become a reflection of it. And fortunately, she had great courage. Because she had suffered so much, she was willing to take a chance. And she started to speak to me from the emotion of rage. And what spilled out of her was all the toxic thoughts she had, all the toxic ideas, all the ways her mind had formed conclusions about people in her life and about life in general based on some really very difficult moments in her upbringing. And as I kept encouraging her by saying, "Yes, and tell me more, and tell me more," she became more and more willing to let this voice of rage speak. And as she did, all the judgment and blaming and opinions and condemning came out of her. And then after she spoke in this way for a while, a softer voice began to emerge. It was the voice of deep, deep hurt and sorrow. It was a more intimate, less guarded voice. But she was literally giving voice to her own pain and suffering. And as she did, I began to see exactly why she was suffering so much. This is the way we human beings are. Our suffering has two components to it. One is a mental component, and one is a very physical, emotional component. And we usually think that these two are separate. In fact, when we're in deep states of suffering or grief or sadness, we usually are so overwhelmed by the emotion that we forget and become unconscious of the story in the mind that's maintaining it, and in many ways creating it. So one of the most vital first steps, if we're to address our suffering and go beyond it, is first have the courage and willing to really feel what we're feeling. To no longer try to edit what we feel, to no longer feel bad if we feel rage or judgment or depression, but to actually really allow ourselves, give yourself permission for a moment. Set some time aside, a half an hour or an hour, And tell yourself that's entirely appropriate, that during that time, you're going to really allow yourself to feel whatever feelings are there, and let them come up without trying to avoid them or even really solve them. And as they come up and you get more and more in touch with a kinesthetic feeling of those emotions, of what they're like when you're not trying to push them away or explain them away, but instead experience the raw energy of the motion. It might be in your heart or your solar plexus or your gut. See if you can identify where the tightness is in your body. Not only where the emotion is, but what parts of your body are tight. It might be the neck, the shoulders, it might be your back. Because suffering manifests as emotion, deep, deep, painful emotion, and also tension throughout the body. And it also manifests as certain patterns of circular thinking. Once you become deeply in touch with a particular state of emotion, then allow yourself to begin to hear the voice of suffering. Now, to do that, you can't stand outside of suffering trying to explain it or solve it. You've actually kind of got to really sink in or relax into the suffering and allow the suffering to speak. Now, a lot of people have great hesitancy to do this because when suffering speaks, it often has a very shocking voice. It can be quite vicious and blaming and condemning. And this kind of a voice is something that most people don't really want to believe that they have in their head. And yet it's vital in order to start to go beyond suffering that we allow ourselves to experience the totality of what suffering is. And of course, suffering is emotion and feeling and thought all rolled together. A quickly swirling pattern of emotion and thinking and feeling. So it's vital that we really open to all of suffering, all that it feels like, all that we think. Once you start to get in touch with the voice of your suffering, and remember, in order to get in touch with the authentic voice of your suffering, of your pain, you have to really be willing to feel it. Otherwise, it's not authentic. Well, once you're really feeling some pain, some deep emotional hurt, start to allow your mind to speak inside your head. You might even talk it out loud. Often, I'll suggest to people that they get a piece of paper and a pencil, and they write down what the voice of their suffering says. I suggest that they try to keep it as short as possible, that each sentence is contained in and of itself, so that the voice of suffering might say something like, I hate the world. The world is never fair. I never got what I wanted. My mother never gave me the love I needed, and so on. And if you take a piece of paper and write these down, they're easier to kind of keep track of. Sometimes if it's all in your head, it just turns into a big muddle. So I often ask people to write these voices of their suffering down. And what you're really looking for is to see how your suffering, how that emotion views your life, views what happened, and views what's happening now. So you really get in touch with the story of your suffering. And again, to do that, you have to be very much open to the level of feeling, emotion, and thought at the moment. The usefulness of starting to realize the story of your suffering in your mind, the judgments, the condemnations, the blames, the resentments, the regrets, is that it's your story that maintains suffering. By unconsciously telling yourself the story that maintains suffering, the emotion continues to regenerate and regenerate and regenerate and regenerate and regenerate.